Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Dr. Gary Ostrower was a little slippery when I stepped out of the house this morning to come down to work. How are the roads over your way, Allegheny County way?
Not so hot. I was driving this morning early to Olean from Alfred, and on Route 244, which leads us from Alfred into Belmont, at least my lane of the road that's going west was very, very icy. I mean, it was black ice. It was about 28 degrees, and there was a light drizzle. And of course, you know, when the drizzle was hitting the road, it simply froze. So I don't think I went over maybe 30, 35 miles an hour over the entire 14-mile strip. On the other hand, Route 86 from Belmont all the way to Olean was in pretty good shape. So I think the Sanders had been out, and I also think there was just a little bit less rain, a little bit less drizzle in that portion of the trip. But in either case, what you said before I think is exactly right on the news. Be careful. There's plenty of black ice out there this morning.
Dr. Gary Ostrower, Bomber Bolton is back, and Bolton is anti-Trump. Alan Dershowitz is pro-Trump. What's going on here?
Well, Bolton, I'm not sure that Bolton is anti-Trump per se. Now, remember, Bolton was the national security advisor for approximately, something less than 2 years. He knows a lot. He's been absolutely central to virtually all elements of American foreign policy from 2018 until, the end of last year. Bolton claims in a book that he has just written that President Trump did indeed say to the Ukrainians that we want you to investigate the Bidens, that namely, the man who the president thinks is likely to be his most important, his most serious rival for the nomination, not his nomination just, but for the election in 2020. Okay, we want you Ukrainians to investigate his son's involvement with a Ukrainian firm, and we are going to withhold $391 million worth of military equipment until you do. Now, the president, of course, has denied that he has ever done this. He's denied that he has withheld this money for political purposes and whatnot. But Bolton has the goods, and Bolton is a first-person witness. Now, what makes this really interesting is that the Senate has said up to this point in the impeachment trial that they are not going to call witnesses. On one hand, they're claiming that the Democrats refuse to allow witnesses, presidential witnesses, Republican-related witnesses during the House impeachment section of this whole process, which is not true. The reason why there were no witnesses because the president refused to allow any of his own subordinates to testify before the House. Now the issue of witnesses goes over to the Senate side, and I think we can understand why the Republicans don't want witnesses in the trial, and that is because people like Bolton are going to argue that, the president was guilty of exactly what the Democrats have claimed in the first article of impeachment, namely that the president conspired with the Ukrainians, or he conspired to withhold aid to the Ukrainians until they cooperated with his political agenda. So Bolton is going to be explosive if he's going to be called as a witness, and at this point, it's kind of up in the air as to whether or not he's going to appear. So far as Dershowitz is concerned, I'm really puzzled by this. Dershowitz is a good lawyer. On the other hand, Dershowitz is not a constitutional lawyer. That's not his expertise, and he's a very, very good criminal lawyer, as I think many of us realize. By the same token, he's now on the president's legal team, and he is saying essentially that unless an impeachable offense actually breaks a law, actually breaks a law, a felony, in other words, it's not impeachable, it's not an offense. And that's just crazy as far as I'm concerned. In fact, even yesterday, when Dershowitz was making this argument in front of the Senate, Okay, namely that, in other words, even an abuse of power, this is what he's saying, an abuse of power that does not actually break a law is not an impeachable offense, and therefore, obviously, the Senate should acquit the president. But it makes no sense. I mean, the fact of the matter is that an abuse of power is an impeachable offense. And if you go back and you read Federalist Paper number 1, if you read Federalist Paper number 65, both of these were authored by Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton makes absolutely clear that an abuse of power is an impeachable offense, that an abuse of trust is an impeachable offense. And what I find odd about Dershowitz's commentary was that he himself said, well, are there scholars who disagree with me? And he admitted that there are. Not only that there are, but most constitutional scholars, whether they be lawyers or whether they be historians, virtually all of them are going to disagree with the point that he's making, to the effect that an abuse of power is not an impeachable offense.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower on the Newsmaker show this morning. Dr. Ostrower, are you watching this impeachment as much as you did Clinton or Nixon on TV?
Only I'm not, but not because I wouldn't like to. My teaching schedule at Alfred University really prevents me from seeing as much of it as I would like. But I've seen a fair amount of it, and then, of course, I've also, watched some of the commentary afterwards with video clips from these comments that have been made by the lawyers. And so I've seen a fair amount, but I'm kind of a political junkie, and I would certainly like to see more than I have.
Right. Talking this morning with Alfred University longtime history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower. I don't know that you would know what the ratings were for the Clinton impeachment or the Nixon impeachment, Dr. Ostrower. I'm thinking that because this has gone on as long as it has, it's not as watched as those other two impeachments were.
My hunch is that you are correct. We're getting a little bit used to this kind of thing. There has been some other, pretty dramatic news, not least, of course, what happened to Kobe Bryant 2 days ago. But what the ratings are, I really don't know. And yet I hope that people are watching. I hope that my students are watching. I've certainly encouraged them to do so, because this is a lesson in constitutional history. It doesn't happen very often. This is only the third time that a president has actually been tried by the United States Senate. I do find that I'm not surprised that this has happened to the president. Republicans have said, the Democrats have been out to get the president from day one. But the fact of the matter is that the president has, in my opinion, and I say this as a historian, not so much as a political person. I happen to be a registered Republican, but the president has committed, I believe, impeachable offenses, and he should be, tried for what he has done. And there's another element here which I think we always have to come back to. You can't believe this president. The Washington Post fact checkers, and these people are careful, have said that since 2017, since he was inaugurated in January of 2017, he has made either false statements or misleading statements over 15,000 times. There is nothing like this that we have ever had in our constitutional history, and nothing like this that we've ever had in our presidential history. And so when the president says, I didn't instruct the Ukrainians to withhold this $391 million for political purposes, you can't believe him. I mean, maybe he's telling the truth, but the likelihood is that he is not telling the truth. He said that he didn't know who Lev Parnas, one of the principal actors in this whole drama, has been. He said he didn't know who he was. And then he said, well, maybe I met him, but I meet lots of people. But now we know that he had many meetings with Lev Parnas. He had many meetings with others who were involved in this whole thing. He has denied just today, just this morning, that he told John Bolton that we are going to link the issue of aid to the Ukrainians with the investigation of the Bidens. But of course, John Bolton, who does have a reputation as telling the truth, you may not like his politics, but there's no evidence that John Bolton is a liar. Bolton, of course, has said exactly the opposite. It puts the Senate in a real bind. I mean, how can they not? If you want a genuinely impartial investigation, how can you not call Bolton, or for that matter, either other witnesses? And if you don't, then you're participating in a cover-up to protect the President of the United States.
Moving on to the topic of the Democrats and their race for the presidency. This is kind of interesting, Dr. Ostrower. I'm reading online this morning that 5 activists from the Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement Action Group, and that I did a Google search on them. They appear to be a liberal group. 5 of their members were arrested for demanding to meet with Biden at his Iowa headquarters but not leaving. 20 people were there. They were asked to leave, and everybody but 5 of them complied. So this follows news this morning on EmpireReportNewYork.com, which is a New York State website. Looks like the Drudge Report has a lot of state news. That Democrat downstate Congressman Tom Suozzi had an event last night that a far-left activist who used to work for Suozzi actually was grandstanding him and not asking any questions, just grandstanding him and going on and on and on, and would not stop and ask a question. Someone tried to take a microphone out of her hand. The person who did that was not with the Suozzi campaign, it should be noted. And she screamed and made a big deal about it. Gary, it seems like the far left of the end of the Democrat Party is willing to disrupt even Democrat events.
Well, they may be, and I'm sure that we're going to see more of this over the course of the campaign. But the far left is not the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, in some ways, is much more diverse at this point than the Republican Party. The Republican Party has largely become kind of, middle-aged, older, white Republicans. The Democrats, of course, are a kind of a rainbow coalition. You have Latinos, you have African Americans, you have young people, a lot of young people, more so than I would have expected at this point, which may mean, we'll see about this, that they're actually going to vote in November. And, of course, then you have, a lot of middle-class women and so forth. That there are some people who are willing to disrupt, yeah, there are some people who are willing to disrupt. I don't think that we should be, terribly put off by that. I think the really interesting thing that's happening in the Democratic Party right now is the degree to which it appears, at least to a certain extent in Iowa, that Bernie Sanders is surging. Clay, that he really is kind of beginning to outpace the rest of that group. If you had asked me, would that have happened? If you had asked me 3-4 months ago, would that have happened? I would have said certainly not. But then again, I'm one of the people who had said way back in 2016 that Donald Trump could never win the Republican nomination. And after he won the nomination, at least initially, I thought that he couldn't win the election. So, I've been wrong about these things. And, for all I know, the same kind of energy and anti-establishment attitudes that so characterized the Republicans in 2016 might make it possible for Bernie Sanders to win the nomination. By the same token, if he does, I think many, many mainstream Democrats are going to have a heart attack. I mean, the fact is that Bernie Sanders is not going to win the election. There are photos, there is video of Bernie Sanders, celebrating the Sandinista victory, the communist victory in Nicaragua way back during the 1980s. There are plenty of other things in which Bernie Sanders, who is an avowed socialist, a democratic socialist, but still a socialist, has called for radical measures in respect to free college tuition and Medicare for all. And I just do not believe that in the final analysis he's going to be able to pull this off. The Republicans, whether it's Trump or anyone else, is going to have, I think, a field day with these kinds of videos. So I think that, many, many Democrats, mainstream Democrats, understand that if Bernie Sanders gets the nomination, Donald Trump is going to win a second term. And that's what I think is really going to drive these folks up the wall.
As you were talking about Sanders, I pulled up the Real Clear Politics polls on the Democrat presidential race, and Sanders comes in number 1 in most places, but Biden comes in number 2. Do you think if it's not Bernie, it'll be Biden?
Well, yeah, I suppose it will be Biden. If it's not Bernie, it probably will be Biden. I think that's correct.
You don't sound excited, Gary.
Well, the Iowa situation right now remains very, very fluid. And the reason I say that is that there are 40%, at least in the last polls that I saw, which were just, over the weekend, there are about 40% of Iowa Democrats who still say that they are undecided. Look, a lot of these people may go over to, Amy Klobuchar as kind of the safe, somewhat more, energetic, certainly younger, moderate Democrat. Or they may say, hey, Biden is, most likely to beat the president, and therefore they will ultimately shift toward Joe Biden. Or maybe, and this is what I think worries so many of the mainstream Democrats, that they might say, well, look, Bernie Sanders really does have the energy. He's packing many, many people into his rallies, just as Trump did back in 2016, and that we're going to give him a chance. But I'm kind of reluctant to make any firm predictions about this right now. I can say one thing, and that is that there is an X factor in this race that we often ignore, and that X factor is called Michael Bloomberg. Trump, I believe, the president, is very, very worried, not only about Bloomberg, but about the fact that Bloomberg has unlimited funds to put into this campaign, more money even than the president has in his own campaign. And how is this going to affect the nomination? I think that Bloomberg is going to become a very serious candidate if Bernie Sanders decisively defeats Joe Biden in Iowa. I think in that sense, Bloomberg is then going to become the candidate for many of the moderates. He is obviously not a socialist. He is independently wealthy. He doesn't have to worry about relying on campaign donations that will compromise his work should he become president. And of course, I think that he's going to become a real factor in the Super Tuesday primaries in March of this year.
We're going to take a quick break talking with Dr. Gary Ostrower. When we come back, we'll do This Day in History. Stay with us.
The DJ you should hire listens to you about the kind of party or reception you'd like to have, pronounces your name right, plays the music you request, not the songs he feels like hearing. The DJ you should hire works out the songs ahead of time with you. Sean Stewart, DJ Truth, for all occasions, weddings, dances, graduations, anniversaries, and parties. 661-7658, 661-7658, 661-7658 for Sean Stewart, DJ Truth.
Black ice out there this morning. It's slippery, Rob.
So, be careful out there this morning as we continue to hover around the freezing point in parts of the southern tier. Still getting some light snow showers and flurries to come off the lakes due to the flow out of the northwest. That'll persist today. More clouds, maybe a flurry or snow shower. Temperatures today 30 to 35. And by the way, because of the black ice, Brian is trapped at the radio station. So anybody who's in the area and wants to bring him a sausage McMuffin, you will be his hero. Sunrise this morning was at 7:27. The sun will set tonight at 5:19. Tomorrow we'll look for lots of sunshine to develop as the upper level low that's been over the area finally moves out. From clouds in 15 to 20 overnight, we move into sunshine tomorrow and a high of 30 to 35. It's clear to partly cloudy tomorrow night, 10 to 15. And the outlook for Thursday, mixture of sun and clouds, temperatures near 35.
Thank you, Rob. Back on with Alfred University history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Before we get to This Day in History, Gary, let's talk about the Mideast plan.
Well, the president, I understand, is going to unveil his long-awaited Mideast plan tomorrow. And it'll be kind of interesting, I suppose, to see what it includes. We have some idea at this point as to what it includes. Why is he doing this now? I think he's doing it now in part because he wants to influence the Israeli elections. You have two elections coming up that are, more than a little bit interesting. On one hand, you have a president who is being impeached in this country, and on the other hand, you have an Israeli prime minister who has been indicted for serious crimes having to do with corruption. And I think that the president of the United States would dearly like to make sure that the prime minister Netanyahu wins the Israeli election, and consequently, he's offering him a gift, and that gift is a peace plan. I saw last night on the news that the Prime Minister of Israel, that is to say Netanyahu, was effusive in his praise of Trump, saying, among other things, that we Israelis have never had a president who has been as supportive of Israel as has Donald Trump. Well, of course, we know that Donald Trump had moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. We know that he has endorsed the placement of some Israeli settlements in what we like to call the West Bank. In other words, we also know that he has withheld $200 million in aid to the Palestinians in Gaza. So, yeah, I think that Trump has indeed been very, very supportive of the Israelis generally, and certainly of Prime Minister Netanyahu specifically. Now, what does this peace plan really involve? The answer is apparently a lot of concessions to the Israelis and not very many to the Palestinian side. It contains approximately 60 pages, which means, in other words, that it is filled with a great deal of detail. We don't know what that detail is. We haven't read it. I haven't read it. I doubt very, very much whether the President of the United States has read 60 pages of detail. So, stay tuned. But one thing we do know, and that is, while the Prime Minister of Israel may be effusive in praise of both our President and of this new peace plan, the Palestinians have already rejected it. They have said, the Palestinian, the head of the Palestinian Authority, Abbas, has said it is, quote, dead on arrival, and I have no reason to doubt that that's true.
Dr. Ostrower, down to the last couple of minutes, it was on this day in history, January 28, 1973, in Vietnam, that the ceasefire went into effect.
Well, I remember that day very, very well. And what I remember is I was living at that time in Alfred Station, a small village here in Allegheny County. The church bells went off. They rang for, I think, around 5 minutes or so. It was a way of commemorating the end of the war, at least for us, the end of the war. But what you did not have were the kind of celebrations that you had in New York in 1918, in November of 1918, when World War I ended, and certainly on both VE Day, that's Victory in Europe Day, on May 8th of 1945, and then again on VJ Day, which was August 14th of 1945, when there were raucous, wild celebrations. I remember, for instance, in 1945, I'm old enough to remember this, that I was in a little village, a little hamlet in upstate New York. It was called Camp Maple, and at the time when World War II ended, my mother gave me a frying pan, gave my brother a frying pan, gave both of us wooden spoons, and we went out. There were about 120 people who were living in this little village, and there were about 120 people who were celebrating the end of World War II. In January of 1973, there were no celebrations. There was a sense of relief that the war was over for the Americans, and we certainly did not know what came next. Well, of course, what came next was the violation of that ceasefire by both the South Vietnamese and especially by the North Vietnamese. And within 2 years, South Vietnam had collapsed, and Vietnam was united under the communist regime of the North. It was a sad chapter in American history. We finally got out of a war. It was the first war that the United States had clearly lost, and for that reason, I guess you don't celebrate a defeat in wartime.
With that, we have to leave it as always. Dr. Ostrower, good having you on.
Thank you very much, Brian.